Welcome to our joint talk on the perception of paleontology and volcanology in video games, and as a primer for science communicators and as an educational tool. So just to go through the basics on the introduction side, why video games at all? And I think plain and simply, this statistic here does it fairly well, that in 2020 alone, approximately 2.7 billion users generated and nearly 60 billion US dollars in revenue. So this is clearly a massive global industry. However, when it comes to using video games to teach, this paper by Geology et al., they looked at the different methods that volcanologists use to teach, whether it's maps, video games, or hand specimens. Of their 55 respondents, they had a total of 194 different methods, and you may spot at the end, only one of these was video games. So this is clearly a very big niche that isn't being exploited within our community. So what about video games and sort of specifically how to subdivide them? Because they come in lots of different flavors. You have racing games, puzzle games. For me and Jake, our main sort of way of subdividing them is whether we talk about educational games, those which are primarily designed to educate, or entertainment games, those primarily designed to entertain. Of these, educational games can be subdivided into academic games, so whether they have been created by academics using a research grant. In these two volcano examples, they were designed to teach local inhabitants. So for example, the St. Vincent game, this was designed to teach locals at St. Vincent about the volcanic hazards that they could experience. And the results show that they're really great for teaching local communities. They find it a really good way to visualize the stories that their elders have been telling them. However, they don't see that greater global impact, and for the rest of us video game players, we don't tend to find them as fun, really. So what about what are known as AAA education games? These are ones which are designed by people who make video games for a living. They know their target audience, they know how to try and get us engaged to some degree. The problem with educational games is it's usually in this format that you see here. You are in a room, you have a puzzle to solve, you go into the next room, you get a slightly harder puzzle to solve. And you rinse and repeat that until you get to the end. Or more often than not, you get bored because they're not really all that engaging, and it's very much so, it can be quite condescending to play these games. So what about the other side of it, the AAA entertainment games? These are the really popular ones. These make up the bulk of those statistics that I showed earlier, and that $160 billion revenue. And these are the ones that we in particular enjoy the most and also are most interested in our studies. And just to prove that I'm not making this up, that these entertainment games are more popular, is some quick statistics on some popular education games versus entertainment games. These are the number of copies sold within the franchise. So Brain Age has a respectable 35 million. However, you compare that to the other side and you're in hundreds of millions of copies sold. There's even one franchise called Educational Games for Kids. I could not find out how many copies this had sold. It's that popular. So why consider using entertainment games at all? If they're not designed to educate, then why should we bother? Well, I'll give you a few reasons. For a start, they are naturally captivating. These are my own stats from 2022. I've not looked at them since because these numbers have gone up and I don't want to see those numbers. But as you can see, these games are holding my own interest for over 100 hours, even 400 in Animal Crossing's case somehow. It came out in the pandemic, leave me alone. You can explore worlds. If you think for those who have organized field trips, in the amount of hours you've spent writing risk assessments, hiring vehicles, traveling to the accommodation, then traveling back out again to the outcrops, this can be days, weeks of time wasted. Here, I logged onto my Switch, 5 seconds later, I'm on the moon. So quick and simple transport. Video games tend to naturally be rich in geology, whether that's the developers borrowing landscapes from the environment and accidentally incorporating that geology into it, or purposely put there because you've got a resource-based video game where you have to collect stones and metals to craft into tools and shelters and things. So they have a lot of geology in there, more than I think most people realize. There's also vocabulary. It's crazy to think about how many people know what obsidian is because of Minecraft alone. They know that obsidian is a volcanic rock / glass that is formed when water and lava mix. They may think that, it's harder than diamonds because you need a diamond pickaxe to break it, but at the same time, I read in a chakra book that obsidian can also absorb pollution out of the environment. So, it's not the worst thing, but it's at least getting these terms into a child's mind that you wouldn't get otherwise. And the final example I'll give is something called tangential learning. This is where it's a type of self-education that you get the person interested in that topic by using a medium that they enjoy, in this case, video games. And from there, they then go off to do their own research on it. And this is actually one that I did years and years ago when I played RuneScape, where you have to mine, in the introduction, copper and tin and smelt it into bronze. And so I thought to myself, is that actually true? So I Googled it, ended up on Wikipedia, and it turns out it is indeed true. Bronze is a metal alloy of copper and tin. And being on Wikipedia, this sent me down a whole rabbit hole of what is a metal alloy, how is steel made? And this was actually a few years before I was then taught it during my GCSE chemistry. And during those lessons, I got nicknamed as the metal nerd because I knew all about metal alloys because I'd read about it from a video game. And so that hopefully gives you a bit of an idea about sort of the fact that video games can be used as an educational tool. And just to give a break from my voice and to make things a bit more interesting, oh no, never mind, there's another slide. Just to take it into account, you do have to take things and everything that we say with a pinch of salt, because after all, these video games that we're looking at, they are designed primarily to entertain. That means that a lot of them are set in fantasy worlds that aren't real. They're not restricted by the laws of physics. It's just coding from whatever the developers want. And they are designed to entertain. So things like having dragons stomping over lava flows or a rainbow volcano, that's just normal in video games. But even in these things that aren't realistic, you can still take that away and you could say, ask students to say, why is this wrong? Just because you can see it with your own two eyes doesn't mean that it actually happens. So it's bad. But as I said, I shall move on and pass it on to Jake, who is going to talk about his research of paleontology.
Thank you for the introduction, Ed. Try to put this on without breaking anything. There we go. Okay, so for this part of the talk, I want to examine a really unique and underappreciated aspect, just a snapshot of how paleontology is perceived by the public. For those of you familiar with video games, I want to preface this by saying this isn't like a thinly veiled rant. You know, someone could do that kind of talk, but that someone is not me. These are questions. These are things that I do not find particularly interesting. When we wrote our paper, it was more a labor of love than anything else. You know, we were always pleasantly surprised by the care and accuracy taken by many game developers and the educational potential for some of the games I'm going to try and talk about today. for those of you who may be watching or here who are not as familiar with video games, I totally understand your apprehension to this topic. I think we all know that paleontology has inspired a deluge of film franchises and documentaries and books, and we're all very much aware of the discourse that surrounds a lot of them. But very little thought is given to video games, which is a shame because video games have fostered, despite stereotypes, a large and diverse audience, and there is a not inconsiderate chunk of them keeping up with our findings, visiting our museums, and even crucially, attending our open days, perhaps on the back of some of these titles. So this is kind of the question that I want to try and answer with my part of the talk today. If your entire understanding of paleontology stemmed from gaming, how would you perceive our world? What kind of impression would you have of the work that we do, who we are, and most importantly, is the version of paleontology that you would maybe get from a video game, is it inviting to a prospective student? So our study began by just going through the hundreds of paleontology adjacent video games that exist. And part of this was achieved by looking at the tags that users had given games. As you can see, some are way more popular than others. And some of the games we found this way, not too useful to the study. Quick shout out to Raptor Boyfriend, a high school romance. And on a similar related note, I opened the Pandora's box one day while we were making this paper of looking at adult-only games that were on Steam. Don't do this. There's so many of them. Deeply regret that part of our study, but I'm a diligent scientist. I had to check. So to make handling hundreds of games a little easier, we grouped them into a few main categories. So the most popular one, ancient animals serve as adversaries. There's something to defeat in order to progress. In the second most popular category, these are ancient animal simulators where you're just playing as an ancient animal and trying to survive. And there's loads of these games with rival developers and their players arguing over whose game has the best models and environments. In the third most popular, it's sort of, you're making your own paleo zoo, you're making a Jurassic Park, you're caring for the well-being of different ancient animals. Then we've got sort of using ancient animals as weapons and vehicles and kind of just not dehumanizing them, but turning them into tools. And then in the most important to us at least, are games in which you can collect fossils, because these are effectively paleontologist simulators. And within each of these categories, there were a few reoccurring tropes that we felt could really influence a player's understanding of our field. And that's basically what we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk. The first trope is ancient death machines. They are not all as dramatic. Ancient animals have served as video game bad guys since the beginning. In 1981, the very first 3D video game, 3D Monster Maze, features a T-Rex kind of as the antagonist. And we found that in this game and more recent titles like it, ancient animals have been portrayed as hyper-aggressive monsters, multiple times larger than their fossils would suggest, covered in unnecessary spikes and spines, and mindlessly, noisily torpedoing towards the player, unlike any living predator would actually do today. In games depicting living animals, it's really common for predators like wolves and bears to be monsterified in this way, but not herbivores. They're usually docile and in the background. But this is not the case for games about paleontology, because herbivorous animals are just as violent and grotesque as the carnivores are. So the issue is not necessarily that they're being portrayed inaccurately, though that's certainly part of it. It's more that they have been turned into monsters. And monsterification is a term that paleo artists like to use for deliberately ignoring fossil evidence to reconstruct an ancient animal as a monster. So just imagine for a second this ridiculous waterfall of theropod dinosaurs. If they were zombies or robots, the tone of the game is basically unchanged. But if they were lions or elephants, that is really weird. And that's kind of the trick with this. This portrayal of ancient animals disassociates them from actual once living organisms. Our idea is that, this could have quite a dangerous knock-on effect of distancing us from ancient ecosystems, maybe even ancient climates entirely. And that's quite a challenge for science communicators. Fortunately, we did identify a handful of games that did reject this trope. And this is a game called Abzu, in which you play as a deep sea diver. And there's a great level where you meet ammonites and helicoprion and mosasaurs, and you interact with them in much the same way that you interact with the living marine fauna throughout the rest of the game. I thought that was actually really lovely. The second trope is, of course, that a fossil equals dinosaurs, which equals Tyrannosaurus rex. You've probably noticed dinosaurs are apparently synonymous with all ancient life. To the surprise of literally no one, the vast majority of games that we examined had at least one dinosaur in it. And, you know, this is unsurprising. Even outside of entertainment, dinosaurs tend to overshadow other work and insert themselves where they're not wanted. On one hand, I get it. Dinosaurs are extremely popular, and they have been for 200 years almost to the day. And they're very recognizable to a casual audience. But, you know, in older games, we tend to find there's like 5 or 6 classic dinosaur species. And newer games do have a little more diversity. But with hundreds of millions of years of ancient life to play with, it's such a shame we keep finding ourselves in boring old late Cretaceous North America. In the rare instance that a game does boast a wider roster of fauna, they tend to take a grab bag of the most iconic and charismatic animals from any era of Earth history, with little to no context for where or when they lived. This is a game called Ark Survival Evolved, and all of these animals, including trilobites and fishes and mammals and the odd fantasy creature, are referred to in-game as dinosaurs, which is really fascinating. And this is nothing for poor paleobotany. No game developer has ever once considered maybe there wasn't grass during the time of dinosaurs. Ultimately, this all presents a false impression that ancient ecosystems lack complexity compared to today, diminishing our knowledge of diversity and species distribution throughout geological time and space. And again, as science communicators, we should be prepared to combat these tropes. Excuse me a second. One example of a game with a uniquely non-dinosaurian setting that I love is Ancestors: The Humankind Odyssey. This game is set in Miocene Africa, and you encounter all sorts of really niche Miocene animals, including an animal called Stegotetrabelodon, a stem elephant that no one has ever cared about before, because this is the only media that it's ever been featured in. And I think that's really worth celebrating. The third trope is that evolution is just leveling up. So in outreach, we often find ourselves saying things like, a giraffe has evolved a longer neck in order to reach high up leaves, or a corpse flower in bloom smells like rotting flesh in order to attract flies. But neither of them decided to do this. That's not how evolution works. But in a lot of video games, the conscious act of leveling up is often conflated with evolution. So, for example, Pokemon, many of which are based on the fossil record, evolve from a basic to a superior form. But that's metamorphosis. The horrible little creatures you create in Spore evolve by cannibalizing traits from the animals that they outcompete. By far the worst depiction of evolution is a game called Cell to Singularity, in which you just click the screen, progressing through a checklist of evolutionary events. You can even speed up the process by spending real money. Insane. All of this proves that basically, evolution, it doesn't plan ahead like that. And that checklist approach to evolution, it just reminds me of such outdated notions about, humans being the sort of pinnacle product of evolution, because in Cell to Singularity, that's how it works. That's when the game ends, you reach humanity. And again, that's something science communicators should probably bear in mind. For a game that gets evolution right, look no further than Fossil Corner. In this game, you use fossils to infer evolutionary patterns by observing the anatomy between a collection of fossils. It's great. It's a very gamified approach to the phylogenetic concepts like maximum parsimony that I use in my research trying to solve the relationships of fossil fishes. I wholeheartedly think that you could set this up in the museum and it would be a huge success. And I've spoken to the developer about this, and he's pretty keen, but also very busy. So the fourth trope I want to talk about is paleontological fieldwork, which is often depicted as little more than stamp collecting. But there's some darker elements to this section, which we'll talk about in a moment. But first, when you stop and think about it, it is truly ridiculous that in a game like No Man's Sky, a space exploration game, you can take on such amazing roles as a merchant smuggling through enemy territory, or an intergalactic pirate blasting your enemies for scraps, or a paleontologist looking for crabs. That's hilarious to me. That's so funny. So in games, fossil collecting is quite an involved process. You know, you're rewarded for your patience and your precision with virtual fossils. There's even some games, this is Dinosaur Fossil Hunter, which is a simulator game, where you even jacket the bones that you find in plaster. I've done this out in fieldwork, and it's so bizarre that someone would include such a detail. But fossils also serve a very wide and unusual range of functions, from resurrecting extinct life to creating fertilizer to creating virtual displays. And I really have to quickly stop and commend Animal Crossing for their Natural History Museum, which was so lifelike. We ran like virtual tours of this place during lockdown, and it was fantastic. But in all of these games, fossils are for sale. They are a tradable commodity. And you know, the commercialization of paleontology, normalizing that, isn't too surprising, given just the frequency of dinosaur skeletons making headlines for selling for obscene amounts of money. Ultimately, I think developers maybe struggle with the concept that a fossil is simultaneously a natural resource, like Ed was talking about earlier, like rocks and wood and metal, but it's also a part of a region's culture and its heritage. It's like pottery or art. It's unique to that region. And people struggle with that in the real world too, right? So it shouldn't be news to anyone that paleontology is deeply rooted in the practices and the aesthetics of colonialism, extractive and exploitative practices such as the illegal poaching of fossil material from colonized or low-income countries, the refusal to repatriate stolen fossils, and the erasure of indigenous research. They're all so intrinsic to like the mythology of paleontology that they often appear in video games entirely unchallenged. And scientific colonialism, it takes on many subtle and underlying forms that can be difficult to really imagine and uproot. But one example that's really easy to grasp is parachute science, where researchers from higher income countries, typically in the global north, will arrive into the country, collect valuable fossils, chuff off back home, and at no point interact with any researchers in that country. They're never consulted or involved in the research. And in some countries, that is actually illegal. It is considered theft. And some of the most high-profile fossil discoveries in the last 5 years have been stolen fossils from places like Brazil and Mexico and Myanmar. So what I'm getting at, these are countries that our brilliant colleagues and friends, Raja et al. Identifies as frequent victims of scientific colonialism. And this paper is such genuinely exceptional research. And I feel so stupid following it up with the next sentence that's going to come out my mouth, but here goes. In the video game, Jurassic World Evolution, it is the player's role to micromanage all the little aspects of their big paleo zoo, including sending out research teams to real-world fossil localities to find fossilized DNA. Over the course of the game, you unlock more and more locations, and perhaps some of you know where this is going. If you wish to add the dinosaur genus Irritator to your Jurassic Park, you just dispatch a team to Brazil and they go and find you one. The game lets you do this to all of the countries I just mentioned. And it even tells you that if your team finds a fossil that isn't a dinosaur, they automatically sell it for you, and that money then goes back to your park. It is insane that someone researched all of these fossil locations and the fossils that they hold, but then didn't learn about the laws and the very recent history associated with, some of the most unethical practices in our field. I like to think that these issues are at the forefront of my mind when visiting a museum, visiting the collections and deciding which fossils that I want to work on and include in my work. But maybe we need to incorporate this more into our public engagement too, because, otherwise this narrative, the narrative that this is what paleontology is all about, it's just going to continue. Video games will continue to normalize it. Finally, let's talk about the depiction of paleontologists themselves, paleontologists as characters. What separates video games from other media is their interactability. You're not just watching scientists, you're meeting them and role-playing as them. Unfortunately, paleontologists in video games tend to come in a couple handfuls of stereotypes. So paleontologists typically depicted as men, either as sort of elderly, doddering professors like Professor Snail from Stardew Valley, or grizzled young white men in a wide-brimmed hat. And I'm being hyperbolic here, but I've met enough people in this field I do not trust the protagonist of Dinosaur Fossil Hunter. He is banned from some conferences, I am pretty sure of it. So meanwhile, female paleontologists, of the very rare few that exist, are inexplicably presented as incompetent fraudsters. So in the cowboy game, Red Dead Redemption 2, you meet this character, Deborah McGinnis, and her design and her backstory all allude to Mary Anning. She's like a 19th century woman in paleontology, looked down upon by her misogynistic male peers. But if you help her with her research, her peers are validated, and it's revealed that she's actually been a terrible scientist all along, and she turns her fossil collection into this monstrous chimera. I didn't even realize that this was a reoccurring trope until Ed told me about a character called Careless, as in careless, in the Pokemon games, who is also this this weird scientist who haphazardly combines fossils to create living chimeras. It's really weird that that's a thing. Where did that come from? Intentional or not, these stereotypical characters, the stereotypes that these characters embody, they allude to some real world issues and form part of a cycle of underrepresentation. Historically, older men who are white, not disabled, cis, straight, etc., have dominated the narrative of paleontology. The path that each student takes throughout their academic career is going to be different. It's unique to everyone. But disproportionate challenges tend to affect the same underrepresented groups from reaching senior roles. Video games are not made in a vacuum, and the lack of diversity in our field has shaped the depiction of paleontologists in media. And a lack of representation and a lack of role models has been cited as one of the reasons people from minority backgrounds are discouraged from joining our field entirely. So it's this very big cycle that video games sort of reflect back a small part of. I think by their very nature, video games lend themselves to some of the worst tropes in how our field is depicted. At some point, you've probably seen a documentary like these that has this voiceover like, can this lone, rugged hero uncover the mysteries of this lost world? That's a video game. That's the plot of basically a video game. And I haven't got time, but there's a really excellent article by Riley Black about this sort of trope of a lone, brilliant scientist that I highly recommend you read. But I think this comes back to The Lost World, a book written by Arthur Conan Doyle in 1912, in which an ancient ecosystem is found in the Amazon basin by white explorers. Video game developers love this theme. And there's countless games where protagonists like Lara Croft and Turok delve into a hostile foreign land with dinosaurs and caricatured indigenous people and culture. I've intentionally left out any images for today's talk. We delve into it a bit more in the paper. We identified a recurring theme of paleo-inspired games habitually exotifying Black and indigenous women through a sort of veil of prehistory. It's really gross. It couples racism and sexism, and it's not inviting at all. So throughout writing this paper, we were reminded of another really brilliant article by Alex Fitzpatrick, who was an archaeologist at the University of Bradford. And she wrote about how many of her peers are guilty of internalizing the narrative of Indiana Jones running into an ancient tomb, guns blazing, and applying it to their fieldwork, resulting in, again, quite an off-putting and toxic culture. Video games do have an enormous potential for outreach, but unless you're prepared to vet the titles like we've done here, you're going to have to sift through a lot of harmful misinformation and misrepresentation. The impact of this misinformation is really difficult to quantitatively measure, but when we wrote this paper, the response was very mixed. We had, for every lovely message we had from a game developer or an educator reaching out for advice and collaboration, we got some pretty nasty comments from the gamers who interpreted our paper as an attack on them and their hobby. That's why I named this talk, or we named this talk, I should say, sorry, a primer for science communicators. Video games are not made in a vacuum, I'll say it again. These issues are symptomatic of how paleontology presents itself, which is partly our own responsibility. We'll move over to Ed in a second, but I just have to give enormous thanks to my co-first author, Thomas Clements, for masterminding this project. He walked me through what was actually writing and submitting my very first presentation. And I also need to thank our co-authors, Richard, Terry, and Valentina. Writing this paper during lockdown was genuinely such a lovely distraction. If you want to read our paper, you can scan the QR code or just Google paleontology video game. It's like the first result. And if for some reason you want to hear more of me talking about this stuff, the podcast Paleocast has a sort of YouTube gaming spin-off called the Paleocast Gaming Network. And there's some videos on there of me and my colleagues talking about these games, playing them, talking about them in much more detail. Thank you so much, but don't go anywhere just yet because we're going to hear about some volcanoes. There you go.
Thank you. Yeah, so that was Jake's exciting research paper on paleontology. So for the next couple of slides and for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking about my 2 papers on volcanoes in video games. So the first one, volcanoes in video games with Dr. Jasmine Scarlett. This was, the intention of this paper was to look at all the different popular video games and find as many volcanic features as we can find in them and see what are the most reoccurring, and of them, what gets portrayed correctly and what not so much. The second one that I wrote with Dr. Lewis Alcott, in this paper, it's based on Pokemon Legends Arceus, where the map of the game, the map called Hisui is directly inspired by the map of Hokkaido in northern Japan. And so what we wanted to see is how many features in the video game could we find that look geological? Could we then translate them to the real world map and find out a little bit more about the geology and see, could it be used as a way to facilitate tangential learning? So I'll be giving you a few examples from these 2 papers. But first off, if we're looking at volcanic features in video games, volcanoes are always a great place to start off with. And I don't have the stats for this because it's constantly changing as more games come out and as I play more, but it's pretty close to 9 out of 10 times, if you find a volcano in a video game, it will be a stratovolcano. And in these examples, you'll always see lava pouring out of them, or they're extremely steep, like unnaturally steep volcanoes. And although I haven't spoken to any developers about the reasons why, I think I can draw on some conclusions. First off, why stratovolcanoes? Well, if I ask all of you here today to draw me a volcano, I bet you're going to draw me one similar to those. If I tell you to add a few more details to it and flourish it out, you're going to have lava pouring out of it, because that is the public perception of volcanoes. They are giant mountainous peaks with lava constantly pouring out of them. Sadly, they're not quite as entertaining as that. They tend to just be quiet, dormant mountains, and every now and then a bit of excitement. As for why they tend to be unnaturally steep, in a lot of cases, the volcano is the landmark feature of the landscape that you traverse. It's meant to be exciting. It's meant to make the players go, wow, look at that. And so because of that, they make them extremely big. But by making them really big, it takes up a lot of real estate. And as you can see in this example of Phoenix Rising, the developers want to add a few temples in there, but you can't do that if you've got a massive wide volcano. So all they do is simply just and shrink it. But they keep it nice and dominating the landscape. So it's all really tall, but really narrow at the base as well. But, you know, that is what video games are. And as I said, they don't have to follow the laws of physics. However, in recent years, the game developers have been getting a bit more complex with their volcanoes. This is one of my favorite examples. This is Fire Spit Island in Pokemon Legends Arceus. And we can see there's a lot of complexity here. There's the old edifice, marking the remains of an old volcano that at some point in its history had a very violent explosion. And since then, there's been some resurgent volcanism where the magma has come back up and it started to regrow. And this is what we see in examples like Krakatoa with Anak Krakatau, or in Mount St. Helens growing its lava dome. If you decide you want to get a bit artistic, you can try and extrapolate from the slopes of the old edifice to work out what did the old summit look like, if you decide you're that nerdy like me. And if you're then thinking, well, where did this mountain of rock go? Did the developers think it was just a hard-boiled egg, you know, chop the top off, throw it away? Well, actually you can see that they didn't. They thought more realistically. As you see, there is a scar within the old edifice, and there's this beach here, which looks very much like a debris avalanche, where all of this remaining summit material cascaded into the sea. And this tends to happen in a lot of explosive eruptions for these island volcanoes. Most of this debris does get washed into the ocean, which is kind of annoying for us volcanologists who want to study these because we can't get to them as easily, but that's just the way it goes. As I said, 9 out of 10 times they're stratovolcanoes. For that 10% or 1 out of 10 occasions, you would think that the second most common volcano would be shield volcanoes, which are really common on Earth, or even fissures, because they're really easy to develop. You just create a crack in the ground and make lava come out of it. But from what I'm finding, the second most common type of volcano in video games are actually calderas, which, as someone who studies them, caldera is quite a technical jargon word. So to have these crop up is quite, for me, exciting. I love it. But these are some examples where you have a lake with an island in the middle that's set in the southwest of Hisui. And if we look on Hokkaido, maybe just about see it as a small lake with an island in the middle, and it looks like this. This is Lake Toya, and it was actually formed from a caldera-forming eruption 110,000 years ago. And so the lake is sitting within Toya caldera. And we actually get some, a bit of evidence from this from Pokemon developers. At some point in the storyline, a character will tell you that this lake that you can see, people believed it formed from an eruption that occurred hundreds of years ago, formed this big crater, and created a lake afterwards. And that is exactly true. That is what happened. That's how caldera lakes form. So for me, I love calderas, and I love the fact that these are becoming more common in video games. As I said before, you can't have a volcano without lava, apparently. That's just the way the public love to see it. But with lava, it has two places in video games. One, to be aesthetically pleasing and to make the landscape pop with some color. The other is also to create a bit of a hazard that people have to traverse. And so as a result, we often get these massively over the top molten lava lakes, or you get these rocky paths that you have to narrowly jump over and run through within a magma chamber, which sadly, as exciting as it would be to see the inside of a magma chamber, there are 101 reasons as to why that's not physically possible or why you wouldn't survive doing it. So molten lava doesn't really have the most realistic representation within video games, but cooled lava does. As it turns out, when the developers decide they want to add a bit more flair, a bit more texture to their landscapes, they do actually create realistic volcanic features in them. This example here with the Hoey Hoey lava, when Jasmine sent me this image, I genuinely thought that was a picture of the Hoey Hoey lava. But then she said, it turns out it's a screenshot from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And I have to say, it looks even better than the Hoey Hoey lava erupting out of Hawaii. It looks, the texture and the detail on it is so much better. We also have columnar jointing. That's extremely common when the developers decide, I want to add a bit more shape to it, and creating polygons within video games is really easy. So to create these hexagonal columns it doesn't take too much work. In fact, it's probably easier than just creating normal bumpy hillsides for them. And in the example of RuneScape, we actually call it a basalt rock. So you're getting this synonymous jointing of terminology of basalt, columnar jointing. And so as we often hear, basalt columns, although I have a dacitic pyroclastic ignimbrite columnar joint on my desk. So they're not always basalt, they're not always in lavas as well, but it's still a step in the right direction. And this is, as I said earlier, introducing vocabulary to players who might not otherwise get such an education on it. If they want to get a bit more exotic, it's not the best image, but you can just about see some pillow lavas which have been forming underwater in Subnautica. Or we got this brilliantly electric blue lava, which has these yellow deposits around it. And for anyone who thinks that maybe blue lava doesn't exist, what on earth is that? You can simply Google blue lava and it will take you to, is it Kawah Injun in Indonesia, which actually has so much sulfur in the lava as it dissolves, the sulfur ignites and creates this famous blue lava here. So nice segue into tangential learning there. And we even have the sulfur deposits being eaten away by a graveler there. Ash, if I was going back to that drawing a volcano analogy, you'd probably maybe draw an ash plume in it. And consequently, the third most popular or frequently reoccurring volcanic feature I find in video games is ash. Sadly, it does tend to get relegated to just simply particle effects in the environment. It doesn't usually cause too much of a problem. We found in one game you start choking a little bit. But in this example of Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, this is the example that I both most love and most hate. Most love for the left-hand picture, where you can see the volcano is actually occurring in the south and a prevailing wind is blowing it north across this region, blanketing it and giving this palish, dirty gray color to it. And it's blanketing all the vegetation. But if you walk through the grass, you can knock all that ash off. So I've created a nice green strip through it. And this is very realistic. When ash does fall on landscapes, it can just blanket the vegetation, so much so that they can no longer photosynthesize and they end up perishing. On the downside to it, you got all of these characters who are running around in this ash, with this one girl saying it's fun to walk through volcanic ash. And there's even a child here hiding in the ash. Do not do this. Volcanic ash is pulverized rock. It can be very, very irritative to your lungs if you inhale it. If you do it for too long, as these people have been doing so, it can, in extreme cases, result in death. So don't listen to this game, please. Also, volcanic features don't have to be related to eruptions. You can have, when magma is very close to the surface, it heats up and creates hot springs. And so they tend to either be nice places to populate the map with, just a bit of a different texture, or if you can interact with them, they tend to end up healing you, which is linked to a lot of medical studies that say the mineral-rich waters are great for your health. Whether they're right or not, or if they're just promoting geotourism, I'm not a medic, I won't say. Although taking a dip in Blue Lagoon is very nice and relaxing, so would recommend. If the developers want to get a bit more animated, they can also make the geysers explode. So these are rare to find, but always nice to see them pop up. And then lastly, volcanology is not just about studying volcanoes and their eruptive products. It's also about the cultural element to it, those who live in the shadow of the volcanoes and how they deal with it and how it incorporates itself into their culture. So in our paper with Lewis, I really wanted to find out why the obsidian fieldlands was called obsidian fieldlands. We know that the map was based on Hokkaido in northern Japan. Japan is a volcanic island arc. We know from Minecraft that obsidian is volcanic. Therefore, my hypothesis, I bet you can find obsidian on Hokkaido. More specifically, I bet you can find it in the obsidian fieldlands. Turns out I was half correct. You see, this map shows all of the red triangles. They are locations where you can find outcrops of obsidian on Hokkaido. And the red box is where the obsidian fieldlands is roughly located. And you see there's two examples, 6 and 12, which are close to it, but it's not really the strongest evidence. It's not one that makes me go, yes, I was correct. So I did some further research. what can you find in that area that's obsidian? And it turns out you can find these. They are obsidian tools made by hunter-gatherers on the island. And these, the Japanese archaeologists, what they did is they used a portable XRF to analyze the chemistry of the tools and the chemistry of the outcrops to see where did they come from? Could they trace them back? And from the thousands that they analyzed, a small proportion did come from 6 and 12, but the vast majority of these obsidian tools found in the lowlands actually came from these in the northeast, over 170 kilometers away and over an entire mountain range. And some of these tools were even found on main island Japan and over in Korea. So it's believed that not only were these tools incredibly useful for the hunter-gatherers, but they were also a very important trading commodity. And so from this, it's a very important reason why the Japanese developers of Pokemon should incorporate this into their game. And they did so not just by calling it the Obsidian Fieldlands, but they took this one step further with this guy. It's called Cleaver. You can see from his design, he's got these black rocky axe arms, and he's also got some very sharp, jaggedy, blacky rock textures on his face, which look very reminiscent to obsidian. He is obtained by using this item called black augurite. Black augurite doesn't exist in the real world, just to point that out. But it does look very similar to obsidian. And you give obsidian to a Pokemon called Cyver, and he'll evolve into Cleaver. And Pokemon even released this statement alongside Cleaver to get fans hyped up about it. But I won't read the whole paragraph, but the last sentence, it is said that the people of Hisui once used pieces of stone that had fallen from Cleaver to craft into tools. So that is the linkage between these obsidian tools and the Fieldlands. And going even further, because Pokemon couldn't just leave that alone, the only place where Cleaver will spawn is in the Obsidian Fieldlands. And the only 2 places you can find black augurite in the game is rarely in the Obsidian Fieldlands, but more commonly in the Coronet Highlands, the closest location to where the vast number of obsidian outcrops are found on Hokkaido. So very nice cultural link that Pokemon are including in their video games. So that's all I'm going to go for because I don't want to take up any more time. However, I will say if you want to read my papers and Jake's, they're on geoscience communication, and I've got another one which is in the works with Press Start looking at the volcanic evolution of Death Mountain in the Legend of Zelda series. So that should be coming out soon in their next publications. And just say thanks to Jasmine Scarlett and Lewis Alcott, as well as the Sprites of Life team. They run a podcast. Go check them out. They're great fun, and they always love it when we end up doing this stuff. So go listen to them and all their other wacky stuff on other things in video games.